Welcome back for part 2 of our lectures on marijuana. So we're going to start talking about the pharmacology of marijuana, and we'll start by talking about the group we'll call cannabinoid chemicals. So we talk about THC as being the primary active psychoactive substance in marijuana, but actually chemically it's a very complex plant. There are more than 420 chemicals in marijuana, so if you've ever heard that association between marijuana and 420, that's where that comes from. And about 70 of these are known as cannabinoids. So THC is, excuse me, definitely the most pharmacologically active, and it has been created in a laboratory setting, and that occurred in 1964. The major metabolite, so as THC becomes metabolized in the body, is 11-hydroxy-delta-9 THC, and that would be what is tested for when tests are done for the presence of cannabinoids in the body. So pharmacology of marijuana varies depending on the method of consumption. So when marijuana is smoked, the THC is absorbed by the blood, and then it travels to the brain and the rest of the body rapidly. We see the peak effects begin to occur within 5 to 10 minutes of exposure. Now, when it comes to orally administered marijuana, we do see some differences there. So when marijuana is consumed in an edible format, then it's absorbed more slowly. The peak effects there don't occur until about an hour and a half after they're ingested. So in states that have legalized recreational use of marijuana, we have seen some effects that occur there. People who are either unfamiliar with the time course of marijuana, or they're unfamiliar with the difference in time course when marijuana is consumed, have consumed higher amounts of marijuana and THC than they intended to because they felt like they weren't feeling any effects. So important to know the differences and how that occurs. In terms of the metabolism, THC has a half-life of about 19 hours in the body, and that means that to completely eliminate THC and its metabolites, so those products of metabolism, may take 2 to 3 weeks. Now, when it's consumed with alcohol, we see variation in that time course, and because of that relatively long half-life, we do recommend at least 8 hours after consumption before people begin to drive. In terms of the mechanism of action, marijuana actually, or the THC rather, binds to 2 different sets of receptors, CB1 and CB2. So the CB1 receptors, these are found primarily in the brain, but also throughout the body. They're not evenly distributed throughout the brain, but they have a particularly high density in specific regions. And these would be the regions that associate with movement, memory, higher cognition, and reward. So we see more of those CB receptors in the brain regions that associate with those. And then the CB2 receptors, these are actually found mainly outside the brain, and they're related to immune cells, and we see that this may be the potential pathway for the role of cannabinoids in immune system function. So as we talk about medical use of marijuana, we do often see studies done on autoimmune diseases like arthritis and MS, where people are reporting positive results. Keep in mind, anytime that we talk about research with marijuana, we tend to see small study sizes and mixed results. And basically this has to do with the fact that it's been very difficult to conduct studies with marijuana for several decades now. So when we do see those smaller studies, we do see people reporting positive effects for those autoimmune diseases, and we think it may be related to the widespread receptors, the CB2 receptors, that are really designed for endogenous cannabinoids, so basically substances that our body produces that act like cannabinoids, and they're spread throughout the body. So this may explain the widespread effects that marijuana can have on those types of diseases. We do see fewer receptors for this in the brainstem, which may be part of what protects people from overdosing on marijuana. The primary cause of death from overdose is typically respiratory depression, so people just stop breathing. But because we don't see as many receptors for cannabinoids in the brainstem, we don't see that effect of cannabis and THC on respiratory function. Okay, so marijuana also has some cardiovascular effects, and this tends to be dependent not only on the dose but on the method of consumption. So on the left here we have smoked marijuana and graphs of how that would affect heart rate at different concentrations, and on the right is oral THC, so in edible form being consumed. And we can see peaks in about 10 minutes on heart rate from the smoked marijuana, and then that longer time course that we talked about for the oral THC. Again, the higher dose, the greater the effect on heart rate, and we see the highest concentration there being about 4%. Okay, other physiological effects that we associate with marijuana use, these include reddening of the eyes, mouth and throat dryness, and then some other pulmonary effects. So a brief exposure, or the acute effect of marijuana on the respiratory system, we see few effects on breathing, but we do see with chronic use that heavy doses of marijuana could lead to a significant impairment of lung function. This is probably more associated with the inhaling of the smoke than anything else. All right, so behavioral effects. Anytime we talk about behavioral effects, we tend to start with self-administration, whether this tends to be a substance that leads to dependence. And we do see that in both animal and human studies that both organisms will self-administer THC. Under controlled laboratory conditions, marijuana cigarettes that have higher THC content tend to be the ones that people prefer, but we do know that in social settings that participants seem to choose more oral THC, so some differences depending on the environment. We do know from the limited amount of data that we do have available, we've concluded that the abuse potential for THC, the number of people who will have trouble stopping, the percentage is actually lower for THC than for alcohol. We see typically about 15% of the population that is exposed to alcohol that have a potential to abuse, or the lack of ability to stop, and we see only about 10% of that for THC. But we also see a very similar role for social factors with THC than we do with alcohol. And we think back to that video we watched of the students who were drinking non-alcoholic beer and still acted like they were. So we see again that role for our expectations for the drug and the setting in which we consume it. A couple other behavioral effects. Some of these are subjective, that they're experienced differently in different users. Some users report euphoria, some report mellowness. We do hear hunger reported, that perception of the munchies. Infrequent users, the effects tend to be similar but more intense when we compare them to people with more exposure to the drug. Now, at high concentrations, infrequent users, so novice users or users that have not been exposed to the drug on a regular basis, they're slightly more likely to report negative effects such as mild paranoia. We do see that marijuana and oral THC are both associated with a significant increase in total daily calorie intake, so that urban myth of the munchies is not necessarily entirely mythical. And then in terms of verbal behavior, we do see this interesting change in communication behaviors. We see fewer verbal exchanges, but researchers have documented an increase in nonverbal social interactions. So interesting how that may change the communications behavior in people consuming the drug. And we've also had users report that it exaggerates whatever mood they're currently feeling, and then also personality traits and feelings of empathy as well. So long list of behavioral effects for marijuana consumption. When we start to look at cognitive effects, we're going to break this again into acute and chronic categories. So acute cognitive effects are going to vary between novice users and frequent users. So among infrequent users, people who are not exposed to the drug on a regular basis, we have been able to document that marijuana does disrupt cognitive processes. The cognitive processes tend to be slower, short-term memory is impaired, and then we also see a loss of inhibition, similar to the effects of alcohol that we've discussed. We also find that users are unable to sustain concentration, and we see some problems with spatial processing, so some problems with geospatial relationships. Now, among frequent users, people who are exposed to the drug on a more regular basis, we may see some tolerance here. We see less dramatic effects in people who are more accustomed to the drug. We do see the slow cognitive processing, but not as slow with novice users, and it may be that process of tolerance that relates to that. So something interesting to consider here is what this will mean as we see this trend towards legalization of marijuana. What will this mean for DUI laws? So we have a standard in most of the United States. It's 0.08 for your blood alcohol concentration. So if we do a similar test for marijuana concentration, we already know that the effects of marijuana are going to be different depending on a person's experience with the drug. So something that a novice user, a level where a novice user may experience impairment, may not be the same for somebody who's a frequent user. So it's going to be interesting to see how those that relationship develops as we become more familiar with this process of legalization in the United States. We do have a few more chronic cognitive effects to discuss in the chronic category. Basically, we don't have the data to draw really definitive conclusions about the effect of marijuana on long-term cognition. We have done some long-term studies, but we've seen mixed results, various findings and interpretations of those findings. Based on this, our strongest current evidence, it seems that after abstaining for a month, most of the chronic cognitive effects of marijuana consumption will subside. So regular marijuana use produces few lasting effects if a person stops consuming for at least a month or more. We do see very solid evidence that early initiation is a different problem, that when we see people who start smoking marijuana chronically in their teens, that we do see effects on brain development there. So depending on the age of initiation, we may see some very different results in terms of cognitive function. And we'll wrap up here for part 2 of our lecture on